Hi, John. How are you?
Great, thanks.
Thank you for joining me today for our Cimpress Talks series. I would like to quickly introduce our audience to the series. So, the series is about holding meaningful yet candid conversations with leaders revolving around the subjects such as leadership, organizational culture, technology, and design. Today, our topic is very interesting. For those who are preparing for any sort of interviews, this conversation will prove to be immensely helpful. So, John, I was quite intrigued when we first connected to do an episode for the series, and you said you want to talk about why interviewing is your most important responsibility and
Mhm.
how one can become a better interviewer. To be
Right.
honest, the first question was more intriguing for me. So, let's begin the conversation. And before we start, can you quickly introduce yourself to our audience?
Sure. I'm a technology director. So I lead 5 teams that work on our software in the manufacturing facilities. 3 of those teams are in the US and 2 of them are in India. And I've been with the company for just over 7 years now.
Okay, great. So let us begin. Coming back to the first question, why do you consider interviewing as your most important responsibility?
Right. So I think of it really as a question of leverage. I can't think of many other examples where I invest maybe an hour of my time and then reach a decision that can have consequences that last years or decades based on the decision to hire somebody. It's also important from a company branding perspective. So even if I decide that I'm not going to hire the candidate after maybe 10 minutes of speaking with them, I still want to make sure that they leave with a positive experience. They're going to tell their friends and their colleagues about what the opportunities and the experience they had, or they might even become future companies of one of our future customers of one of our brands. So it's a small world and you really don't want to burn any bridges.
All right. So, what tips would you like to give to someone who has maybe recently taken a managerial role and is new to the process of interviewing people?
Sure. Uh, I think many interviewers are scared to make a hiring mistake. So they offer only timid or neutral recommendations. Unfortunately, that's not really helpful in our decision-making process. Because a candidate only has maybe 3 or 4 different interviewers, that's not a lot of data points, and we can't afford to waste any of them. So as a new interviewer, you need to be decisive. Observe other interviewers if you need to until you're comfortable, but once it's your turn, you need to be able to offer a clear recommendation whether or not we're going to hire this person. You're going to make mistakes from time to time. That's completely unavoidable, but it's also forgivable. You just don't let fear stop you from forming an opinion. That's what we're paying you for.
So, John, pandemic has altered the lives a lot, both in the personal capacities and professional capacities. So, my next question would be about that. How do you think has it altered the dynamic between an interviewer and the interviewee?
So the biggest change, obviously, is the lack of an in-person interaction. There's so many nonverbal signals that get exchanged when we're face-to-face. It's difficult to compensate for all of them in a video screen kind of presentation. I guess my suggestion here is you just need to make sure that you're doing everything possible to be fair and consistent. You want to ask the same questions that you would of a person that you would interview in person. And you want to make sure that when you interview from one to another, that you're asking the same questions so that you can accurately compare them. Many of our coding questions, so as a software developer, we ask a lot of coding questions, and they'll take place in front of a whiteboard when we can do them in person. So personally, like when the degree that I might stand closer or further from one part of the board could be an indication of where I'd like a candidate to focus their attention. So if you find yourself doing something similar in your interviews, you need to find a way to replicate that or replace that interaction when you're doing a remote interview. So you want to make sure that you're holding candidates to the same set of standards and giving everybody the equal opportunity. I think one actual like real world example of this is that we now use in Cimpress this collaborative online coding tool so that I can edit and highlight text at the same time as the candidate. So while they're typing, I can also be contributing to the code. So that's, for me, that's a way that I can replicate some of the ways that I might naturally interact with somebody who's standing at a whiteboard.
Okay. So now that we are working remotely, how has your style of interviewing someone changed? Like, what are your parameters of judging someone's selection or rejection?
Yeah. So actually, I've deliberately tried not to change much about my interviewing style, at least about my acceptance criteria. At Cimpress, we're still looking for the same technical and communication skills that we were before the pandemic started. So I guess maybe one nice part about a remote interview is that because we are now a remote first company, that a remote interview is probably the best way for me to assess how I'm going to be able to interact with this person if we do hire them in the long term. So I'm still assessing their communication skills, how well they understand my questions, how well I can understand their answers, and the remote interviewing lets me do it under realistic circumstances, at least that according to how we're going to be operating in the future.
Is there any fun moment or any special memory that you may remember during the pandemic period of interviewing someone, and if you want to share something, like how has
So
been your experience?
yeah, we've done a fair number of interviews since the pandemic started, and there was one that was ultimately not a candidate that we extended an offer to. We were she had a very different background from something that we traditionally would look for, and I think maybe before the pandemic started, we would have just dismissed her and not had the interview. But it was a valuable learning experience, I think, for both of us. And she learned more about what Cimpress as a company was going to look for as a technical candidate, and maybe she wasn't quite qualified. But through interviewing her, I think I learned that there were a lot of people out there that don't have the traditional computer science background that we want to consider more in the future.
So, do you think that interviewing also helps in your personal and professional growth as well?
Oh, absolutely. I used to teach computer science at the Air Force Academy in the U.S. And I think one thing I've learned is that I never know a subject as well as when I have to teach it to somebody. And interviewing is very similar in that respect. If I have to ask a question, I need to be prepared for whatever somebody's going to say. And I need to be able to steer that interview back on course if they're going off topic. And I need to be able to understand the technical implications that they're expressing, or maybe some of the ideas that they're having within their head. So I really enjoy it, and I do learn a lot from each time I interview.
Okay. So, lastly, in this remote work setup, would you like to share any tips for the interviews as well? Maybe some people who are preparing for some sort of interviews right now.
Yeah, I think, well, for the candidates, you mean?
Yes.
Okay. So for candidates, I'd remind them that a remote interview, while it might feel less formal than an in-person one, you have to approach it the same way that you would an in-person interview. That means you have to be as professional as possible. So I'm not expecting, just like in person, we don't expect people to dress up in suits and be extra formal. But if you're going to be taking a remote interview, you got to do the basics. You got to make sure your technology is working properly, that you're in an environment that's free from distractions. You want to give yourself all the advantages that you can in this kind of remote interview setup. And I think the last thing is I'll also share the same advice that I would give to any in-person or regular candidate. Just relax, try to learn from the experience and have fun. Remember that the interviewer just might be as nervous as you are.
Right. That's true. All right. So I think it was a very great conversation for anyone out there helping both the sides of the professional landscape. So thank you so much, John, for taking out time for this conversation. I
Of
really
course, my
enjoyed
pleasure.
it.
Yeah, no, thank you. Me too.
I would like to thank our audience as well for watching this. Do let us know how you found this episode, and we'll soon be back with another interesting topic. Thank you, John.
You're welcome. Bye-bye.
Bye.